multiplying complex numbers. Now, before we actually multiply complex numbers, let's take a step back here to our complex number, which is the square root of -1. Now, if we take the square root of -1, I want to think of that as times the square root of -1, and keep in mind here that -1 times -1 is really like saying I times I, because the square root of -1 is I. So I'm going to take square root of -1 times the square root of -1, and I'm going to rewrite it as the square root of -1 squared, because I have the same thing multiplied twice. So then I can say, well, the square, or I times I, is the same as saying I squared. Well, let's go back up here for a minute and say, well, the square root of -1 squared, really what's going to happen here is my squared is going to cancel my square root, and I'm going to be left with -1. So the question then becomes, well, then what's I squared? Well, isn't this the same as this, and this is the same as this, and this is the same as this? So really what we're saying here is I squared equals -1. This is the big takeaway. This is the thing you have to circle. This is the thing you have to memorize. Because if we're talking about standard form of complex numbers, which is a plus bi, notice here there is never, or there is no I squared. I squared cannot be in a final answer with a complex number because I squared is really the same as -1. Example 4, multiply. Letter A, 4i times the quantity -6 plus I. I'm going to start by distributing my 4i. 4i times -6 is -24i. 4i times I is positive 4i squared. Now, if I'm looking at a plus bi for standard form, I have an I squared. That's a problem. Well, I squared on the last page we just said was the same thing as -1. So this is really like saying 4 times -1. And then I'm just going to drop everything down. And then I'm going to clean this up. So this is -24i minus 4. And then I have to put that in standard form. So I'm going to put the -4 first, the -24i second, so that my real part is first and my imaginary part is second, and that's our answer. Letter C, quantity 9 minus 2i times the quantity -4 plus 7i. In order to do this, we can either make a box or we can FOIL. I'm going to choose to FOIL, which is our distribute. 9 times -4, -36. 9 times 7i, 63i. Then I'm going to distribute my -2i to my -4, which is positive 8i. And then -2i times 7i, which is -14i squared. A couple things we're going to do here. 63i plus 8i, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71. So 71i. Then I'm going to drop down the -36. Then I'm going to take a look at this, my I squared, and say, okay, that's really -14 times -1. If I clean up a little bit more, I still have a -36. I still have a plus 71i, but now the negative times the negative is a positive 14. Then I can take my -36 plus my 14, which is a -22. Bring down plus 71i, and then check for standard form. Your real number is first. So there you go. Letter B, the quantity 3 minus the square root of -16 squared. First of all, whatever you do, do not distribute that squared. It doesn't work that way. Remember, we write it twice. 3 minus the square root of -16 times 3 minus the square root of -16. Now, I'm looking at that, and I really don't want to multiply the square root of negative 16 times the square root of negative 16. So if I take a look at this, the square root of negative 16 is really like 4, but because I have this negative in here, that's an I, so this is really just 4I. Keep in mind this negative is on the inside, this negative is on the outside, so you cannot put them together to make a positive. Insides and outsides don't match. So that negative just becomes the I, and this is 4I. So what we're dealing with here is 3 minus 4I times 3 minus, and I'm going to do it again, 4I. At this point, we can distribute. So 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times negative 4I is negative 12I. Then I'm going to distribute. My negative 4I times 3 is negative 12I. And negative 4I times negative 4I is positive 16I squared. At this point, a couple things. That's a negative 1, so this is really 16 times negative 1. Ultimately, that's going to be a negative 16. Then if I'm kind of looking ahead, I can put my 9 with my negative 16, which is going to give me negative 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, negative 7. Then I can come back and I can combine my negative 12i and my negative 12i, which is negative 24i, and we're done.